Archie Goodwin here. Welcome back to Riddle Stop. Now I could tell you today's story is about a crate of furniture arriving a few hours behind schedule, but that's like calling a house fire a warm evening. A delivery crew who got a flat tire that wasn't flat, took a shortcut that dead-ended into sawhorses nobody ordered, and had their dinner paid for by a stranger they couldn't describe, 5 minutes after he walked out the door. A dispatcher who assigned one truck to one route on one specific Wednesday and told himself for weeks that the envelope of cash in his coat pocket didn't mean what he already knew it meant. An import broker found dead in his own study on the one night his usual routine broke, with a safe standing open and a housekeeper who'd been told, uncharacteristically, not to wait up. A daughter who spent 9 years being told her father's heart simply stopped, and never once believed it, because he'd left her mother 4 words to remember him by: find Aldous' conscience. A well-tailored importer with a warehouse lease under a name that traces to nobody, an alibi solid enough to survive a poker table, and a temper that turns out to belong to somebody else entirely. A groundskeeper working under his mother's maiden name, mowing the lawn of a man he'd spent a decade convinced got away with murder, waiting every Wednesday for the one night the house would finally be his alone. And then there's the detail nobody counted on: a false bottom built into a crate of ordinary furniture, a second false bottom inside the strong box hidden beneath that, and 15 years of smuggled stones disguised as shipping tonnage in a ledger that almost never made it out of Great Neck at all. So get comfortable. This one's called Nero Wolfe and the Late Delivery. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. 3 a.m. and a crate. There are certain sounds a man learns to recognize in his sleep, and in the years I've lived at 900 and West 35th Street, I've learned most of them. Fritz's slippers on the stairs at 6, Wolfe's elevator groaning up to the plant rooms at 9, Theodore muttering to an orchid like it owed him money. What I had never learned to recognize because it had never happened was the sound of Loyal's low, uncertain growl at 3:15 in the morning. Not the sharp bark that meant trouble, but the rumbling, puzzled sound he made when something didn't fit any pattern he'd been taught to sort. I was down the stairs in my robe before I'd finished deciding to go. Diana was already at the front window, up on her hind legs with her paws on the sill, ears forward, tail dead still, which for Diana is the canine equivalent of a headline. Caesar stood at the door itself, not growling, just present, the way a locked bank vault is present. Mars paced. Apollo had vanished toward the back, checking, out of long habit, whether the front was a diversion for the rear. Minerva sat by the stairs, watching all of it, the way she watches everything, like she was keeping score. Outside, idling at the curb with one headlight dimmer than the other, was a delivery truck that had clearly seen better decades, and standing on the stoop, illuminated by the one working porch bulb, were 3 men who looked like they'd been awake since Coolidge was president. Fritz got there a step behind me, tying his robe, and looked through the peephole, with the expression of a man deciding whether a raccoon has gotten into the garbage or the house is on fire. "Archie," he said, "there are men." "I can see that, Fritz. The question is whether we let them stay men, or whether Caesar has opinions about it." I opened the door on the chain first, which is a habit Wolfe insisted on after an incident I won't get into here, and looked out at the 3 of them. The one in front was somewhere past 50, built like a fire hydrant, with a cap pushed back off a forehead that had given up worrying about wrinkles years ago. Behind him, a younger fellow, maybe 25, kept glancing over his shoulder at the truck like it might drive off without him. The third was somewhere in between, and he was the one holding a clipboard like it was a life preserver.
"We got a delivery," the fire hydrant said, "for a Mr. Nero Wolfe. Sorry about the hour. It's been a night."
"It's 3 in the morning," I said. "Whatever it's been, it's going to have to be a very good story." "Mister," said the young one, "I have driven this route for 11 months, and I got lost tonight on a street I could drive with my eyes shut. I don't have a good story. I have a true one, which is worse." I unhooked the chain. There's a rule of thumb I've developed over the years about people who show up exhausted and half frozen with an impossible story at 3 in the morning. The ones who are lying tend to have the story polished. These 3 didn't have a story so much as 3 separate fragments of a bad night, none of which lined up, and none of which they seemed capable of inventing, even if they'd wanted to. Caesar let them in, which is to say he stood aside, which for Caesar is a formal act of clearance, like a maitre d' pulling out a chair. Loyal fell in at my heel, still uncertain. Mars flanked the group without touching anyone, the way he does with strangers whose intentions haven't been proven yet. They wheeled in a crate. It was a good 3 feet by 2, banded in metal strapping, and it had clearly travelled, mud on the corners, a long scrape down one side, and a shipping label so smeared by weather that I could make out perhaps a third of the address it was supposed to have gone to. "So," I said, "where's it supposed to be, and why is it here instead?" The fire hydrant. His name turned out to be Gus Del Vecchio, and he'd been driving trucks since before I could tie my own shoes, took off his cap and turned it in his hands, like it might have answers written inside. "It's supposed to be in Great Neck. Was supposed to be there by 7 last evening. Fella named on the manifest. Private residence, out past the yacht club." "And it's not in Great Neck," I said, "because," said the middle one, the clipboard fellow, whose name was Whit Sorrell, and who had the anxious precision of a man who'd spent his whole life being blamed for things that weren't his fault. "Because we had a flat tire that wasn't flat, and a shortcut that wasn't a shortcut, and a diner where a man who wasn't anybody bought our dinner, and then 11 minutes I can't account for, and I have never in my career left a manifest unaccounted for, and I would like it on the record that none of tonight was my fault." "It's 3 in the morning," I said again, mostly to myself this time, "and I'm being handed an alibi by a man who hasn't been accused of anything." That was when Wolfe's voice came down the stairwell, and I want to be clear that I have heard Wolfe angry, and I have heard Wolfe irritated, and what came down those stairs that morning was a new and specific register of both. "Archie, it is 3:11 in the morning. I would like an explanation that justifies my having left a comfortable bed, and I would like it before I lose what little patience the hour has left me." He came down in the yellow silk robe he reserves for genuine emergencies, moving with the offended dignity of a man who considers sleep a professional obligation. He looked at the 3 delivery men, looked at the crate, looked at Diana still frozen at the window, and something in his small, sharp eyes, something that I have learned over the years to recognize as the precise moment his outrage converts into interest, shifted. "That crate," he said, "was not banded at the point of origin. It was rebanded. Recently, the strapping is newer than the crate by some measurable margin, and the nail pattern beneath it doesn't match the original construction." Gus Del Vecchio looked at the crate like it had personally betrayed him. "We never touched the banding, mister. Swear to God." "I don't doubt you," Wolfe said. "That is precisely what interests me." He looked at the young one, who by now had introduced himself as P.T. Marchetti, and who was visibly torn between exhaustion and the dawning suspicion that this was going to be a longer night than the one he'd already survived. "Mr. Marchetti, you said you got lost on a road you know well. Tell me exactly where." And that, at 3:14 in the morning, on a night when he ought to have been 8 hours deep into orchid dreams, was how Nero Wolfe accepted a case he hadn't yet been asked to take. Chapter 2. A Matter Beneath the Manifest. By 4, Fritz had produced coffee, which Wolfe drinks under protest, and only in what he calls conditions of siege, and the 3 delivery men were arranged around the office in the particular postures of men who have been awake far too long and have stopped trying to look alert about it. Gus had his cap back on. Whit Sorrell held his clipboard like a shield. P.T. Marchetti had his head tipped back against the red leather chair, and one eye open, watching Minerva, who was watching him back with the patient interest of a cat at a mouse hole. "I want to be plain about something," Wolfe said, once he'd gotten a full report of the evening's misfortunes. "I have no interest, ordinarily, in the misdelivery of freight. It is a matter for your dispatcher, and your dispatcher's superiors, and possibly for a lawyer, none of whom are me. What interests me is that someone appears to have gone to considerable trouble to ensure this crate did not arrive where it was addressed, and I find myself curious as to why, and unable to satisfy that curiosity without further information. Mr. Goodwin will ask the questions I would ask myself if I were willing to leave this chair before sunrise, which I am not." I got out my notebook. "Let's take it in order. Gus, you're driving. Tire first." "Tire first," Gus agreed. "We're maybe 40 minutes out of the depot, running fine, and the truck starts pulling. I get out, and it's flat. Not slow leak flat, mister. Flat like somebody let the air out of it on purpose," which I said at the time and got laughed at for saying. "We're on the shoulder 25 minutes changing it. I checked the valve stem after, because something about it was bothering me, and there's no nail, no glass, nothing. just flat. Someone with access to the truck, prior to departure, Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. That's what I figure now, Gus said, though I didn't figure it then. Petey, the shortcut. Petey sat up a little. I've driven this route since I started. There's a cut-off past the reservoir road, saves maybe 15 minutes, and I've taken it 200 times. Last night I take it same as always, and it dead ends, just dead ends, into a construction barrier that wasn't there Tuesday when I drove it last. Construction barrier, I said. Legitimate, or set up. I didn't stop to check for a permit, if that's what you mean, Petey said, with the first flash of humor any of them had shown all night. It was dark and it looked official enough. Sawhorses, a lantern, but there wasn't any actual construction. No equipment, no hole in the road. Just a barrier. Wolfe's eyes had gone to half slits, which is his equivalent of another man leaning forward with his mouth open. White, the diner. White Sorrel straightened his clipboard on his knee like it needed disciplining. We're behind schedule by then. Temper's short, and we stop at a place off the county road. The Wagon Wheel, it's called. We've stopped there before. There's a fellow at the counter, friendly type, strikes up a conversation with Gus about the truck, asks where we're headed. When the check comes, it's already paid. Waitress says the fellow at the counter took care of it before he left, said it was a kindness for hard-working men. We never got his name. Description, Wolfe said. Ordinary, White said, and I could see this bothered him more than anything else that had happened. That's the trouble, Mr. Wolfe. I've been trying since to picture his face, and I can't do it. Medium height, grey coat, spoke pleasant. Nothing you'd remember him by, except that you'd remember there was nothing to remember him by, if that makes sense. It makes considerable sense, Wolfe said. A man who has trained himself to be forgettable is a more alarming proposition than a man who has trained himself to be memorable. Archie, note that. And the 11 minutes. This was the part that had been eating at Whit Sorrel since before he'd walked in the door, and it took a moment to get it out of him. We stopped behind a shuttered feed warehouse. Off the county road, needed to check the tire pressure on the spare, make sure it'd hold. All three of us are out of the cab. The crate's in the back, under a tarp, same as it's been all night. When we get back in, I mark the stop in my log, same as always. Standard procedure, except I look at the time after, doing the arithmetic for the office, and there's 11 minutes I can't account for between when we stopped and when we started again. Not a long stop, not unusual on its own, but 11 minutes, and none of us can say where they went. Was the crate disturbed? Wolfe asked. Strapping looked the same, Whit said. I didn't think to check close. Why would I? It's a crate of furniture, near as the manifest says. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the crate itself, which I'd had Gus and Petey wheel into the office and set beside his desk. Archie, open it. I got the crowbar from the front closet. Wolfe keeps one there for exactly these occasions, which tells you something about how often exactly these occasions occur, and worked the lid free. Inside was a set of furniture legs, packing straw, and a sideboard drawer wrapped in brown paper, all perfectly ordinary and perfectly boring, exactly as the manifest promised. Wolfe had me lift the bottom panel out entirely. Underneath it, in a shallow compartment that hadn't been part of the crate's original construction, you could see the fresh cuts in the wood. Pale against the aged grain was a bundle of papers tied with string, and beneath that, a small tin strongbox with a lock that looked older than the crate itself. Nobody said anything for a moment. Even Loyal, curled at my feet, lifted his head. Well, I said, I suppose that answers why somebody wanted this crate badly enough to flatten a tire, fake a detour, buy 3 strangers dinner, and steal 11 minutes nobody was supposed to notice missing. Wolfe looked at the strongbox the way another man might look at a rare orchid just coming into bloom. It answers why, Archie. It does not yet answer for whom or from whom or what precisely is worth this degree of choreography to conceal. He turned to the 3 delivery men who were staring at the false bottom with the expressions of men discovering that their ordinary Tuesday, it had in fact been a Wednesday, which I only mentioned because Wolfe would have insisted on the correction, had become something else entirely. Gentlemen, I am going to ask you to remain here until Fritz can arrange proper beds, because I suspect your evening is not yet finished, and because I have a great many further questions once you've slept. In the meantime, I believe I owe your employer a telephone call, and I believe the Great Neck address on that manifest owes someone an explanation." It was Fritz, an hour later, who took the call that came in on the office line, a call from the Nassau County Police, informing whoever answered that the resident of the Great Neck address in question, a Mr. Aldous Threnody, had been found dead in his study sometime after midnight, and that the household help had reported a break-in. Wolfe, informed of this over a plate of Fritz's 4 a.m. eggs, a concession he does not make lightly, set down his fork with the particular care he reserves for moments of genuine gravity. "Well," he said, "it appears our delay, gentlemen, may have saved rather more than a night's sleep." Chapter 3. 5 Ordinary Inconveniences. I got maybe 4 hours of sleep before Wolfe had me down in Great Neck, and I want it on record that 4 hours is not enough sleep for a man being asked to reconstruct a murder scene, but Wolfe has never been generous about that particular arithmetic. The Threnody house was the kind of place that made you understand, in a single glance, why a man might spend his whole life protecting an inheritance, white colonial, black shutters, a lawn that had clearly employed more gardeners than most Broadway productions employ actors. There was a county detective named Halloran on the scene, a heavy-set man with the look of someone who'd rather be fishing, and he was inclined to be uncooperative until I mentioned Kramer's name, at which point he became merely reluctantly cooperative. Threnody, Halloran told me, was some kind of import broker, old money on his mother's side, new money on his own account, lived alone except for a housekeeper who doesn't sleep on premises. She found him this morning, struck from behind, study ransacked, safe standing open and empty. What time did she leave the evening before? 6:30. Says he was expecting a delivery that night and told her not to wait up for it. That lined up with the manifest. The crate had been due at 7, and the delivery never came because it got lost somewhere on the way here. "That's what I hear," Halloran said, looking at me with the particular flatness of a man who suspects I know more than he does and resents it. "You want to explain how a private detective from Manhattan knows more about my crime scene than I do?" "I'd love to," I said, "just as soon as I know it myself," which was, at that stage, entirely honest. I spent the rest of the morning working the neighborhood the way Wolfe likes it. Worked, not asking anyone anything directly at first, just getting the shape of Threnody in other people's words. A neighbor 2 doors down, a Mrs. Halverson who watered her roses with the dedication of a woman who had nothing else demanding her attention, told me Threnody kept to himself, entertained rarely, and had a nephew who visited when he wanted money, which was often. A grocer's boy who delivered on Wednesdays said Threnody had seemed nervous the past 2 weeks, jumping at the doorbell. The Great Neck police had already released the housekeeper by the time I found her, a stout, red-eyed woman named Bridget Fallon, who'd worked for Threnody 11 years and clearly hadn't decided yet whether to grieve him or resent him for dying on her watch. He wasn't a warm man, she told me, over tea she made without being asked, in a kitchen that still smelled of the coffee she'd have brought him that morning if he'd lived to drink it. But he was fair mostly, and regular in his habits, and regular men don't usually end up murdered in their own studies. Something's been eating at him since spring, though. He'd take calls at odd hours and shut the study door so I couldn't hear. Twice I found him standing at the window past midnight, just looking at the street like he expected somebody. Any names come up? Visitors, callers, anyone who made him nervous? There was a fellow came by twice in the last month, she said, frowning at the memory. Well turned out, charming, the way certain men are charming when they want something. Introduced himself as an old business associate. Mr. Threnody wasn't glad to see him, I can tell you that. Went pale the first time, and after that I was told to say he wasn't home if the man ever called again. You get a name? Price, I believe. Lucian Price. I only remember because Mr. Threnody said it under his breath after the fellow left. The way you'd say a word you didn't like the taste of. That was the first time the name came up, and I want it on the record that I didn't think much of it at the time. A Manhattan businessman with an unpleasant manner is not on its own a murderer, and I've known plenty who weren't. It was only later, once Wolfe had the ledger's arithmetic worked out, that the name meant what it turned out to mean. Back at the brownstone that evening, Wolfe insisted on the delivery crew being questioned again, now that they'd slept. I laid out the day's harvest, while Fritz served a dinner that even under the circumstances managed to be extraordinary. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, which I have learned means he is listening harder, not less. 5 inconveniences, he said, once I'd finished. The tire, the barrier, the diner, the 11 minutes, and now a 6th, retroactively, Mr. Threnady's nervousness, which suggests he anticipated trouble before it arrived. Archie, a man does not arrange for a truck's tire to be deflated at a depot without knowing which truck, on which night was carrying which crate. That is not opportunism. That is a plan with knowledge behind it. Which means somebody at the shipping company, I said, or somebody close enough to Threnody to know what he was expecting. Or both, Wolfe said. I want the dispatcher who assigned that route. I want to know who had access to the depot yard the evening the truck departed. And I want Mr. Sorrell to walk you through his log again, this time attending to exactly who was present and where during those 11 minutes he cannot account for. A man's memory, properly pressured, often yields more than he believes he has to give. Before I got to the delivery men, Wolfe had me place a call to the shipping company's dispatch office, ostensibly to confirm the crew's schedule for his own records, but really, as he admitted only when I pressed him, to hear how the dispatcher himself sounded when asked an innocent question about a route assignment. The man on the line, a Yorick Prine, answered every question correctly and promptly, and answered them, I thought, the way a man answers when he's rehearsed the answers rather than simply possessing them. I mentioned this to Wolfe, who received it with the small, satisfied silence of a man filing away a fact he intends to use later. I found Whit Sorrell in the kitchen, where Fritz had more or less adopted him and Petey for the duration, plying them with coffee cake as though hospitality might repair the damage the night had done to their nerves. Gus had gone back to the depot to smooth things over with the dispatch office, but Whit and Petey were still there, and Whit, cake in hand, was more forthcoming than he'd been at 3 in the morning. There's one thing, he said slowly, I didn't think mattered till now. When we pulled in behind that feed warehouse, the 11 minutes, there was another vehicle parked around back, dark sedan. I noticed it because it seemed like an odd place for anybody to park, that warehouse being shuttered years now. Didn't think a thing of it at the time. You get a plate? No reason to look, Whit admitted, miserable about it. But there was a fella leaning against it, smoking. Didn't approach us. Just watching, I suppose, now that I think it through. Same build as your diner friend? White chewed on that along with the cake. Could be. I couldn't swear to it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I reported this back to Wolfe, who received it the way he receives most useful information, without visible satisfaction, but with a very slight settling of his bulk into the chair, the way a man settles when a puzzle piece has confirmed a shape he already suspected. A man who arranges a flat tire, a false detour, a paid dinner, and a watched rendezvous behind a shuttered warehouse, Wolfe said, is not a man improvising. He is a man executing a plan, rehearsed well enough to survive the crew's own unpredictability, because delivery crews, Archie, are unpredictable by nature, and a good plan accounts for that. I want to know who is capable of that kind of preparation, and I want to know what, precisely, was worth Mr. Threnady's life to prevent from ever reaching this house. The papers in the crate, I said. You've had all day. What are they? What are they? Wolfe's mouth did the small thing it does when he is pleased with himself and unwilling to admit it outright. A ledger, Archie, running some 15 years, detailing shipments of goods through Mr. Threnady's import business that do not, upon close reading, appear to correspond to any goods at all, merely to numbers, dates, and a recurring notation I have not yet resolved. And a set of letters, written in a hand I believe belonged to Mr. Threnady's late business partner, a man named Corliss Whitfield, who died, according to the letter's final entry, under circumstances Mr. Whitfield himself seemed to believe were not accidental. So somebody's been running something under the cover of legitimate shipping for 15 years, I said, and Threnody either knew about it and kept quiet, or found out and was going to talk. That, Wolfe said, is the question upon which the rest of this matter turns, and I believe, Archie, that tomorrow you will need to find Mr. Whitfield's family and discover whether they share his suspicions, and whether any of them stood to gain a great deal by ensuring those suspicions never reached anyone who might act on them. Chapter 4. The Long Island Gallery. Corliss Whitfield, it turned out, had left behind a widow, a business partner's worth of grudges, and a daughter who answered the door of a modest house in Roslyn with the guarded expression of a woman who had spent years being asked questions she didn't want to answer. Her name was Priscilla Whitfield Farr, married and separated, and when I told her I was asking about her late father's business dealings with Aldous Threnody, something in her face closed like a shutter. "My father," she said, "died 9 years ago of a heart attack, according to the death certificate. I have never believed that certificate told the whole truth, and I have never had the resources to prove otherwise. If you're here to tell me Aldous Threnody is dead too, I'm afraid I can't manage to be sorry about it." "Tell me about the business," I said, "as much as you know of it." She poured tea I hadn't asked for, the way people do when they need something for their hands while they talk. My father and Aldous Threnody started that firm together in '39, before the war really got going over there. Textiles, porcelain, some furniture, the sort of thing rich people in Manhattan like to have shipped from places that sound exotic at a dinner party. It did well. It did very well, actually, better than either of them had any right to expect. And I remember being a girl and thinking that was simply because my father was clever, which he was, but I've come to believe now, it wasn't only that. "When did it change?" "I couldn't tell you the year," she said. "I was already grown and married by the time I noticed anything, and even then it wasn't anything I could have named. Just that my father grew quieter about the business, stopped talking about it at the dinner table the way he used to, started keeping his study door locked even from my mother. He'd always been a man who liked to explain his work. He stopped explaining it. That was a start, and by the time I left an hour later, I had the shape of a grudge 15 years deep. Corliss Whitfield and Aldous Threnody had built the import business together, and somewhere along the way, Priscilla was vague on the mechanics, but certain about the outcome. The business had quietly begun moving something other than the textiles and porcelain, the manifests claimed. Her father had grown afraid in his last months, she said. Afraid enough that he'd started keeping his own private ledger, separate from the company's books, in case anything happened to him. "There's a cousin of mine," she added, almost as an afterthought. "As I was getting up to leave, Rodman, my father's sister's boy. They were close. Near the end, closer than my father was with me, if I'm honest, which I've never quite forgiven either of them for. Rodman took father's death hardest of anyone. He was convinced, even at the funeral, that something wasn't right about it. I haven't seen him in years. I couldn't tell you where he's living now." I wrote the name down without much weight behind it. A grieving nephew with a grudge is common enough in cases like this that I've learned not to circle names too heavily on first mention. It would be some days before that particular name earned the circle it deserved. "Did you know he kept a ledger?" "I knew he kept something," she said. "I never saw it. He told my mother, before he died, that if anything ever happened to him that didn't look right, she should look for Aldous' conscience, not his own, whatever that meant. She never made sense of it. Neither did I." I reported back that evening to a house that had, in my absence, acquired a full slate of visitors, courtesy of Wolfe's afternoon telephone campaign. Fred Durkin had run down Threnady's nephew, a nervous young man named Denison Threnody Marsh, who owed money to men who did not extend patient terms, and who arrived at the brownstone looking like he expected to be arrested on sight, which, given his uncle's estate, wasn't an unreasonable fear. "I didn't kill my uncle," he announced, before anyone had accused him of it, "which is generally the surest way I know to make a room suspect you did. I know how it looks. I know I owe money, and I know I'm in his will, and I know all of that makes me the obvious fellow to blame. But I was at a card game in the city till 4 in the morning, and there's a dozen men who'll swear to it, though I'd rather you didn't ask which dozen, on account of the game itself wasn't strictly legal." Wolfe regarded him with the mild patience he reserves for people who talk themselves into corners without assistance. "I have no present interest in your card game, Mr. Threnody Marsh, legal or otherwise. I am considerably more interested in your uncle's business affairs, about which I suspect you know rather less than you believe, and rather more than you've said." Denison, to his credit, didn't try to bluff his way past that. He never talked business with me. Not once. I used to ask him for a job, back when I still had some pride left about asking, and he'd always say the business wasn't the sort of thing a young man ought to get tangled up in. I thought he meant it was boring. I didn't think he meant it the way it apparently turned out he meant it. The company's dispatcher, a tight-lipped fellow named Yorick Prine, had been persuaded to appear as well, sweating through a story about the route assignment that didn't quite hold together, and a business associate of Threnady's more recent dealings, a smooth, well-tailored importer named Lucian Price, had come uninvited, which interested Wolfe more than anything the invited guests had said. The dogs, arranged as they always are for a full house, gave their usual silent commentary. Caesar greeted Priscilla with the dignity he reserves for people he's decided are trustworthy. On first impression, Mars stayed close to Denison Threnody. Marsh the entire evening, which is Mars's way of saying he doesn't yet trust a man's hands to stay where they belong. Diana wouldn't settle anywhere near Yorick Prine, circling instead, restless, the way she does when something about a person doesn't add up to a whole number. And Loyal, who is generally the mildest of the six, planted himself directly in front of Lucian Price's chair and did not move for the better part of an hour, watching him with an unblinking, unhurried attention that Wolfe noted with visible interest and said nothing about. Inspector Kramer arrived somewhere in the middle of all this, unannounced and unamused, filling the doorway of the office with his usual air of a man who has been personally inconvenienced by the existence of private detectives. "Wolfe," he said, "I've got a homicide in Nassau County that's suddenly got Manhattan fingerprints on it, and I'd like to know why my Great Neck counterparts are telling me a crate of evidence spent the night in your front hall instead of an evidence locker." "The crate spent the night in transit, Inspector, through no design of mine," Wolfe said. "It arrived here by an accident of misdirection, which I intend to explain fully once I understand it myself. In the meantime, I would ask you to consider that a man capable of orchestrating a flat tire, a false construction barrier, a paid restaurant bill, and a watched rendezvous behind an abandoned warehouse, all in service of intercepting one shipment on one specific night, is not a man who improvises, and not a man you will catch by treating this as an ordinary burglary." Kramer chewed on his cigar and looked around the room at the assembled gallery. The nervous nephew, the sweating dispatcher, the too smooth importer, the wary widow's daughter, with the particular disgust of a man who has seen this exact tableau in this exact office more times than he cares to count. "Fine," he said, "play it your way, but I want to know the minute you have a name, Wolfe, and not a minute after." "You shall have it," Wolfe said, "the moment I possess it myself, which, given present circumstances, I anticipate will not be long." Chapter 5. What Fritz Found in the Lining. It was Fritz, of all people, who cracked the ledger's notation, not through any deduction, but through the kind of accident that happens only in a household run as precisely as Wolfe's. He'd been asked to store the recovered papers in the kitchen pantry overnight, out of the general traffic of the house, and in doing so had set the strongbox down on a scale he uses for baking, more out of habit than purpose. He mentioned to me the next morning, entirely without understanding what he'd stumbled onto, that the box weighed considerably more than an empty tin box of its size ought to weigh, even accounting for the lock. I told Wolfe over breakfast, and Wolfe, 3 bites into a dish of shirred eggs he otherwise would not have interrupted for the president himself, set down his fork and said, "Bring it to me." We got the lock open with a set of picks Saul Panzer keeps for exactly these occasions, and inside, beneath a false bottom of its own, Wolfe made a small sound at this, something between satisfaction and vindication, was not paper at all, but a double handful of loose, uncut gemstones, wrapped in cotton wadding, along with a second, smaller ledger, written in a private shorthand, that took Wolfe the better part of the afternoon to work through. The notation in the first ledger, Wolfe said once he'd finished, was never a code for goods, Archie. It was a code for weight and carat, disguised as shipping tonnage. For 15 years, Whitfield and Threnady's legitimate import business served as cover for the movement of smuggled stones, likely originating from unstable territories where provenance could not survive close inspection, and moved through customs as declared textile and porcelain freight. And Whitfield got cold feet. Whitefield, Wolfe said, appears to have discovered, some months before his death, that the operation had expanded beyond what he'd originally sanctioned, that Threnody had brought in a third party to handle distribution, a man capable of moving stones through channels Whitefield himself did not control and did not trust. His private ledger was not a record of the smuggling itself, which he'd have had no need to hide from his own partner. It was a record of his suspicion that his partner intended to cut him out entirely, and I suspect, a record he kept as insurance against exactly the fate that befell him. So Whitfield's death 9 years ago wasn't a heart attack. I doubt it very much, Wolfe said. And I doubt further that Mr. Threnody spent the intervening years entirely at ease with his conscience, which would explain his recent nervousness, his sudden interest in moving the ledger and the stones out of his own house, and his death on precisely the night he attempted to do so. Saul Panzer, brought in that afternoon to run down the third-party Wolfe suspected must exist, reported back within hours with the kind of efficiency that justified every dollar Wolfe ever paid him. Lucian Price, the smooth importer who'd shown up uninvited the evening before, had, according to customs records, Saul had a friend willing to check unofficially, handled an unusual volume of freight through a specific bonded warehouse over the past several years. The same warehouse, as it happened, that stood shuttered behind the county road where the delivery crew had lost their 11 minutes. "There's more," Saul said, when he came by that evening to deliver the news in person, which he generally prefers to a telephone call when the news is good. Price leased that warehouse under a company name, Meridian Holding, that traces back to a post office box, and the post office box traces back to a lawyer who does a lot of work for men who'd rather not have their names on paper. I couldn't get further than that without stepping on toes. I don't have permission to step on yet. "You've stepped on precisely enough," Wolfe said. "Archie, I want Mr. Price's precise movements on the night of the murder, where he claims to have been, and who can confirm it. A man clever enough to arrange a flat tire is rarely clever enough to also commit a murder himself. Those require different tempers entirely. But I want the possibility eliminated, not assumed." That turned out to be a harder errand than I expected, because Price, when I finally ran him down the next morning at his office on Madison Avenue, had an alibi so solid it was almost suspicious in its solidity. A poker game at a private club, 3 witnesses, a doorman who logged his arrival and departure, and a bill from the club's bar with a timestamp that put him losing money at cards at the precise hour. Threnody had died 40 minutes away in Great Neck. "I don't know what you think you know," Price told me, in the particular tone of a man who is being extremely careful about which true things he says out loud. "But I had nothing to do with whatever happened to Aldous. We did business together, years back. I liked him well enough. That's the whole of it. I didn't believe a word past we did business together, but I also couldn't put him in Great Neck that night, and I told Wolfe as much when I got back." "I did not expect you could," Wolfe said. "A man who plans as thoroughly as our Mr. Price plans does not generally do his own killing. He hires it done, or he arranges circumstances that allow someone else's temper to do it for him. I begin to suspect, Archie, that Mr. Price is guilty of theft and conspiracy, and quite possibly guilty of setting in motion events that led to a man's death, but not guilty, in the narrow sense the law requires for a murder charge, of swinging whatever struck Aldous Threnody down in his own study. He didn't come here uninvited to help," I said. "He came here to find out how much we knew." "Precisely," Wolfe said. And Loyal, I noticed, was of the same opinion. He allowed himself the smallest curl of satisfaction. "Archie, I believe it is time to test Mr. Price's composure directly. Telephone him. Tell him I have recovered a ledger belonging to the late Mr. Whitfield, and that I would value his expertise, as a man familiar with the import trade, in helping me understand its contents." "You're baiting him with the one thing he tried to steal." "I am," Wolfe said, offering him the opportunity to demonstrate, through his response, exactly how much he already knows, which is a great deal more, I suspect, than an honest importer ought to. Chapter 6. The Second Detour. Lucian Price arrived within the hour, which told us something in itself. A man with nothing to hide does not clear his afternoon on 90 minutes' notice for a stranger's ledger. He came in smiling, well turned out, with the easy manner of a man used to being liked. Wolfe received him with the elaborate courtesy he reserves for people he intends to dismantle, offering beer, inquiring after his business, allowing a full quarter-hour of pleasant nothing before he set the ledger on the desk between them, the first one, the shipping tonnage code, not the second. "I understand you dealt with Mr. Threnady's firm regularly," Wolfe said. "On occasion," Price said. "Aldous and I did business when our interests aligned. Terrible thing what happened to him." "Terrible," Wolfe agreed. "I wonder if you might help me with a peculiarity in his shipping records. There's a recurring notation here I can't quite place. Weights that don't correspond to the declared cargo. I thought, given your familiarity with the trade, you might recognize the pattern." Price studied the page with the careful, unhurried attention of a man giving himself time to think. and I watched Loyal, who had positioned himself at the foot of Price's chair, exactly as he had the night before, lift his head and go very still. "Can't say I recognize it," Price said at last. "Could be a private accounting method. Aldous was old-fashioned that way, kept his own systems." "Curious," Wolfe said, "that a private accounting method should correspond so precisely, by my calculation, to standard carat weight." The room went very quiet. Price's smile didn't move, but something behind it did, a small involuntary recalibration. The look of a man realizing the ground under a conversation has shifted while he wasn't watching for it. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mr. Wolfe." "I am suggesting nothing," Wolfe said. "I am observing that Mr. Threnady's import business appears to have served, for some 15 years, as cover for the movement of smuggled gemstones, that his late partner Corliss Whitfield discovered this and kept a private record of his suspicions before dying under circumstances his daughter has never accepted as natural, and that Mr. Threnody himself was killed on the one night he attempted to move both that record and a quantity of loose stones out of his own house, a delivery that was delayed through a remarkable sequence of engineered inconveniences before it could reach its intended thief." Price set down his beer glass with exaggerated care. "That's quite a theory." "It is a fact, arranged in sequence," Wolfe said. "The theory concerns only the identity of the man who arranged the flat tire, the false construction barrier, the paid dinner, and the 11 minutes behind a shuttered warehouse that you, Mr. Price, according to customs records my associate has reviewed, have leased under a business name for the past 3 years. I've watched a lot of men break in that office over the years, and Price didn't break so much as recalculate, visibly the way a man does when he's already halfway to deciding which lie to try next. I'd like to know," he said carefully, "exactly what evidence you believe supports any of this, before I say another word." "You needn't say another word at all," Wolfe said. "You are of course free to leave. I would only observe that Inspector Kramer is presently in my front room, having arrived 20 minutes ago at my invitation, and that he will be considerably more interested in your explanation than I am. Which was, I should mention, entirely true. I'd let Kramer in myself while Price was still admiring the ledger's penmanship." Price looked toward the door. He looked at Loyal, who had not moved from his position, and did not intend to, and something in his face, the practiced, forgettable ordinariness that Whit Sorrel had struggled to describe, finally cracked into something specific enough to remember. Chapter 7. The bill that was already paid. Price didn't confess outright. Men like him rarely do in a single sitting. But Wolfe didn't need a confession, not with what came next. "I brought Whit Sorrel in from the kitchen, where he and Petey had been enjoying an extended and increasingly comfortable residency in Fritz's good graces, and asked him to look at the man seated in the red leather chair. White took his time about it, the way an honest man does when he knows a great deal rides on getting it right. I couldn't swear to the diner," he said slowly, "on account of I told you truthfully there wasn't much to remember him by. But that voice." He frowned, listening as Price muttered something irritable to his own lawyer, summoned by then and doing his considerable best to keep his client quiet. "That's the fella from behind the warehouse. Same voice. I'd know it now I'm hearing it fresh." That was enough to put a very different look on Price's lawyer's face. And it was enough, combined with Saul's customs records and the ledger's arithmetic, to give Kramer what he needed to take Price downtown for a conversation considerably less comfortable than the one he'd had in Wolfe's office. But Wolfe wasn't finished, and I could tell by the set of his mouth that the evening's real business hadn't happened yet. "Mr. Price," Wolfe said before Kramer's men led him out, "was resourceful enough to arrange a delayed delivery. He was not, I think, resourceful enough to have known, on his own, precisely which truck on which night was carrying which crate to which address. That level of specificity required someone inside Mr. Threnady's own household or business, someone who knew his plans before Price did." Yorick Prine, the dispatcher, had gone very pale somewhere around the word specificity. "I assign routes," he said. "That's all I do. I don't know what's in the crates." "You assigned this route personally," Wolfe said, "rather than allowing the ordinary rotation to determine it, according to your own company's records, which Mr. Goodwin obtained this afternoon with your supervisor's cooperation. And you did so on the same day Mr. Price, according to his own admission not 20 minutes ago, first contacted your dispatch office to inquire, quite casually, which routes ran through the county road corridor on Wednesday evenings. I want to note for the record that this was the moment I understood why Wolfe insists on assembling everyone in one room, rather than questioning people separately across the city over the course of a week. There is something about watching one lie collapse that makes the next one considerably harder to hold up. Preen's collapse, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It was tired and a little pathetic. The collapse of a man who'd been paid a sum of money he badly needed and had told himself for weeks that he didn't know what it was for. He said, "It was just information." Preen said, "Just a route. I didn't know anybody'd get hurt. I didn't know there was a crate worth killing over." "You knew enough," Wolfe said, not unkindly, "to take money for information you understood to be worth concealing. That is generally sufficient knowledge, Mr. Preen, in the eyes of the law, and I expect you'll find Inspector Kramer of the same opinion." Chapter 8. Everything arrives at once. It took another day to run down the last thread. The identity of the man who'd actually killed Aldous Threnody, since Price, for all his scheming, had a solid account of his own movements that night, corroborated by his lawyer and, less willingly, by a poker game. 3 witnesses swore he'd been losing badly at the exact hour of the murder. Wolfe had suspected this from the start, I think, though he hadn't said so. A planner sophisticated enough to engineer an entire evening's misdirection was not necessarily the same man willing to strike another man from behind in his own study. Those are different kinds of nerve, and Wolfe has always maintained that criminals, like everyone else, tend to specialize. The answer, when it came from Priscilla Whitfield Farr herself, though she didn't know she was giving it. I'd gone back to see her a second time, at Wolfe's instruction, to ask a single question he'd become fixated on. Who, besides her mother, had known that her father kept a private ledger separate from the company's books? "No one," she said, and then stopped, and her face did the particular thing faces do when a memory surfaces that the person hadn't realized they were still carrying. "Except my cousin, Rodman. He used to visit my father often, near the end. They were close, before things went bad with the business. I always assumed Rodman knew things I didn't." Rodman Whitfield, it turned out, was Corliss Whitfield's nephew, a man who'd spent the 9 years since his uncle's death nursing a conviction that Threnody had murdered him and gotten away clean, and who had, in that time, built a quiet, patient obsession with proving it. He'd taken a position, under a different surname, as a groundskeeper for a property management firm that serviced several homes in the Great Neck area, including, as it happened, Aldous Threnady's. He had, Wolfe deduced and later confirmed, been watching Threnady's house for months, waiting for exactly the kind of opportunity that presented itself the night the crate failed to arrive on schedule, a delay he hadn't caused and hadn't needed to because Price's sabotage had already done the work for him, leaving Threnody alone, nervous and unguarded for hours longer than he'd planned to be. Fred Durkin, sent to the property management firm to confirm the groundskeeper's employment, came back with a detail that settled the matter entirely. Marsh had requested, some 6 weeks earlier, an unusual schedule change that put him working the Threnody grounds specifically on Wednesday evenings, the one night, as it happened, that Bridget Fallon left promptly at 6:30 and didn't return until morning. He'd arranged, without anyone at the firm thinking twice about it, to be alone on that property, unsupervised, on the one evening each week the house was least protected. He wasn't planning that particular Wednesday, I said. Once Wolfe laid the pieces out for me. He was planning any Wednesday. He'd been waiting for his moment for weeks. And received it, Wolfe said, considerably sooner and considerably more completely than he could have arranged himself, courtesy of a flat tire he had no hand in and no knowledge of. It is not often, Archie, that 2 independent schemes converge on the same night by pure accident, and I confess I find the symmetry of it almost inelegant. Real events, unlike detective fiction, are rarely so tidy, and yet here we are. He didn't go there to rob him, I said. Once Wolfe laid it out for me, he went there to confront him about his uncle. I believe so, Wolfe said, and I believe the confrontation went further than Mr. Whitfield Marsh. He'd taken his mother's maiden name, Marsh, for his groundskeeping position, which delayed my identifying him by some hours longer than I'd have intended. A man who has spent 9 years believing himself denied justice does not always control his hands as well as he controls his patience. Chapter 9. The Guilty Man's Silence. Wolfe assembled the full company the following evening. Priscilla Whitfield Farr, Yorick Prine, under police escort, Lucian Price likewise, Denison Threnody, Marsh, looking considerably relieved to no longer be the centre of anyone's suspicion, and at the centre of it, a groundskeeper named Rod Marsh, who had been quietly persuaded, through Saul Panzer's considerable talents at persuasion, to attend a meeting he'd been told concerned property questions regarding the Threnody estate. The 6 dogs took their positions as they always do for these gatherings, Caesar and Mars flanking the door, Apollo and Diana along the walls, Minerva near Wolfe's desk, watching the room with her particular unhurried attention, and Loyal at my side, where he generally prefers to be when the room fills with people whose intentions haven't yet declared themselves. Marsh sat very still through most of Wolfe's recitation, the ledger, the stones, Whitfield's private suspicions, Price's sabotage, Prine's paid cooperation. It wasn't until Wolfe reached the matter of the groundskeeper's position, and the false surname, and the months of quiet watching, that something in Marsh's stillness changed. Not fear, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weight for 9 years and finds himself at last too tired to keep carrying it in silence. "He killed my uncle," Marsh said, before Wolfe had finished. 9 years I've watched that man live in his house, run his business, sleep easy every night, while my uncle's own daughter can't get so much as a death certificate that tells the truth. I didn't go there to kill him, Mr. Wolfe. I went there to make him admit it. I wanted to hear him say it, just once, before I decided what to do about it." "And did he?" Wolfe asked, quietly. "He laughed," Marsh said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that told me, better than any confession could, exactly how the rest of that night had gone. He laughed, and he said nobody was ever going to prove a 9-year-old heart attack was anything but a heart attack. And he was right about that, wasn't he? Nobody would have, except I was standing right there with my uncle's own ledger sitting in a crate that was supposed to arrive at that man's door and didn't, and something in me just... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Kramer's men were already moving toward him, and Wolfe, watching the whole scene with the particular stillness he reserves for the moments when a case resolves into tragedy rather than triumph, said only, "A ledger can prove a great many things, Mr. Marsh. It could not, I think, have proven what you needed it to prove about your uncle's death, and it did not need to end this way to do the little it could." Chapter 10. Delivered, at last. Kramer took his prisoners and his evidence and left with rather better grace than he usually manages, which is his way of admitting, without ever quite saying so, that Wolfe had handed him a solved case, wrapped considerably more neatly than he'd have managed on his own. The stones went to the estate for proper disposition, pending a great deal of legal untangling that neither Wolfe nor I had any interest in following further. Priscilla Whitfield Farr left with something that wasn't quite closure. Her cousin's confession had confirmed her father's murder without undoing the 9 years of doubt that had preceded it, and I don't think Wolfe was under any illusion that we'd handed her a clean ending. He doesn't deal in clean endings as a rule. He deals in true ones and trusts people to sort out for themselves what to do with the difference. Gus Del Vecchio, Whit Sorrell, and P.T. Marchetti, who by then had spent 2 full days as guests of the brownstone, eating Fritz's cooking and, I suspect, telling this story to their grandchildren for the rest of their lives, were finally cleared to return to their ordinary lives, considerably richer than their employers' standard rates would have made them, courtesy of a check Wolfe wrote without comment and without being asked. "You didn't have to do that," I told him, once they'd gone. "They didn't have to notice a flat tire that wasn't flat," Wolfe said, or a shortcut that led nowhere, or a stranger's unearned kindness at a diner counter. Most men would have driven on and thought nothing further of any of it. Their attention to 5 ordinary inconveniences is the only reason a murderer sits in custody tonight rather than free, and Mr. Threnady's estate intact rather than scattered across a black market. I have no desire to further investigate. I consider it money well spent. Fritz had duck going in the kitchen that evening. I could smell it from the hall, rich and unmistakable. Though it never made it to the table, he'd started it for a private supper of his own the following day, and Wolfe, whose appetite for other people's plans rarely extends to interfering with Fritz's, said nothing about it beyond an appreciative sniff on his way to the dining room. Loyal settled his head on my knee that night while I sat going back over my notes, the way he does when a case has run long enough that even he seems glad to see it finished. Diana had already claimed her spot by the window, watching the street the way she always does, alert to nothing in particular now that the particular thing she'd been alert to had resolved itself. Caesar made his last rounds. Mars settled. Apollo checked the back door twice, out of habit rather than necessity. Minerva watched all of it with her usual unhurried patience, keeping score of a night that, for once, had nothing left to add up. "You know," I said, "to no one in particular, there's something to be said for a package that arrives late. If that crate had made it to Great Neck on schedule, Threnodi's the only one who'd have known what was inside it, and he'd likely be alive today, running the same racket he'd been running for 15 years, with nobody the wiser." "An observation with a certain grim symmetry," Wolfe said, settling into his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man whose bed was, at long last, going to remain undisturbed. "The delay that inconvenienced 3 honest men proved, in the end, the only honest thing that happened to Aldous Threnody all night. Draw what moral from that you like, Archie. I intend to sleep on it." The brownstone, for the first time in 3 days, settled into silence before midnight. The dogs at their posts, Fritz's kitchen quiet, the crate long since emptied of everything it had never been meant to carry, and Wolfe, upstairs, dreaming whatever a man dreams after a case that started with a knock at 3 in the morning and ended, at last, delivered.